think in general, we think the future in Africa really is young people, educated young people. And investment is very essential for Africa, and Africa should be open for investment. We have reasonable rule of law. It's not perfect, but it's.
Hello EDUSPLORER, thanks for joining us again and welcome back to another informative video on our YouTube channel. On today's episode, we are focusing on the 7 top things that the African continent and countries within should focus on to develop the continent's approach in terms of productivity and make the continent become even more competitive in the world. So without any more delay, we should just go straight into it. Looking at agriculture should be the primary focus with the African continent. Most countries within the African continent still focus on subsistence aspect of farming. Of course, there are different countries that have taken agriculture to a whole full of different level and some mechanized. However, much of the continent still need to upgrade in terms of agricultural productivity. In that way, more food could be produced within the continent and make it become even more competitive. Also, there's also something very important. The agricultural sector and manufacturing is another very important sector. If there are more semi-finished products and goods, it could determine the African continent's performance in terms of holding back. They won't be shipping more of raw materials abroad to different countries coming to buy those raw materials. Some of those products could be produced within the continent or add value into those products before they're sending them abroad. In that way, more jobs could be created and also they become more competitive, and making sure that the value being added to those products could drive the continent's performance in different levels. Some of these aspects are more important. There are some continents, or countries rather, who are doing this already, but much needs to be done. It shouldn't be just a few countries to help the continent move on from where it is today to becoming even more competitive and in the global economy.
It won't be a source of instability for us. In fact, it will be a great plus for us because when you look at the population of Africa, more than 60% are actually below the age of 30.
Yeah.
So all what we need to do is to be very, very creative and see what kind of jobs are we going to, mind you, we have 60% of the world's arable land. And when you look at the estimation by one of either McKinsey, you see that by 2050, the demand on food alone will go up by 110%. So with that, all what you need to do in Africa is to now tilt back and focus on manufacturing and agriculture. And I think there's quite a lot of things that we're doing which can change the entire narrative and which will make us to provide jobs for Africans. Today, as we speak, agriculture is not all about poor people, because you use a lot of technology, the yield per hectare, everything has improved. So when you look at it, a company like ours, we were never ever interested in agriculture. But right now, we have moved into agriculture, and I can tell you that in the next 4 or 5 years, our company will not have less than 200,000 workers.
Africa should reduce the quantity of food that's being imported. If you look at the African continent, it is very difficult to come to terms that the continent that has one of the highest level force and the cheap labor will still be struggling in terms of productivity. Africa is a net importer of food, and it's unimaginable that a continent that is rich and has abundance of land is still struggling to produce food to feed its entire population. This is something very important, that if the continent focuses on those particular areas, reduce the amount of food imports that come from different countries, there's much abandoned land. The African farmers should perform a little bit more and the agricultural sector should become even mechanized. Something also very important is the cheap labor that is available could be skilled up in such a way that they become more competitive and also more skilled in different areas. By just being that the continent that imports more food than it exports, the continent places itself in a more difficult situation. And in that area, the continent needs to actually diversify its production in different areas, which to make sure that the continent reduce the amount and the quantity of food that is being imported into the continent, to give some farmers a little break And the governments also in some of these African countries need to look into those aspects to kind of mechanize things and also improve the skills of those farmers who are working really hard. In that way, they will reduce the quantity of food that comes from abroad and give the continent a competitive advantage in that area.
Super important. Africa today is a net importer of food.
Yes.
So it's kind of a contradiction. Why is the continent where the availability of labor is the highest, where the availability of unused land is the highest, where the productivity per hectare is the lowest, why can't it move not only to be self-sufficient, but also to be a net exporter? And so the agriculture sector can get better. You don't want to rely just on the agricultural sector. It can create jobs and more value, but as you get somewhat more mechanized, then you do free up labor for other activity, services, manufacturing. There, a challenge is that the educational sector has to come in and do a really good job. In agriculture, you don't need a very high education. But for things like services and manufacturing, you really need not only high school, but a fair bit of college graduates. So it's a challenge to.
Something very big also that's been plaguing the African continent for the past couple of years or the past decades has been that of corruption. Corruption doesn't exist only in the African continent. It does exist in different countries as well around the world. However, that of Africa has been perceived to be as something which has brought the continent to a difficult situation to operate in terms of businesses and different areas. There are different countries across the African continent that are doing really well, that have transformed their societies. For example, Botswana, Rwanda, and also Mauritius are some of the most competitive countries within the African continent. There are other ones like South Africa and other countries that have changed their approaches. But however, by not focusing on to develop or scale or reduce the amount of corruption level, this could scare different investors that are coming in. This corruption is in different countries, in Europe, in Americas, in Latin America, in Asia. However, by Africa coming together to combat this particular phenomenon that has been out there for many years will help putting in policies in place that could reduce the corruption. Also, making sure that implementation of more technological approaches that will help reduce the amount of money changing hands within the continent in different aspects to reduce that amount of corruption will help the African continent become even more competitive in the coming years. Corruption has been a big issue that has plagued the continent. Most of the money being stolen are taken to different parts of the world, and at some time it's difficult to retrieve those funds. So in that way, leaving the continent behind and not making sure that the continent could grow in those different areas. By combating corruption in a hard-handed approach that will help the continent drive its growth forward.
Well, the other problem, I think, also is this perception of corruption. Let's be frank. In a lot of minds in the West here, people think Africa is a very corrupt place. Corruption is a problem, a global problem, but I don't think it is an African problem. Corruption exists everywhere, and actually many African countries are quite good. Some African countries actually are better than some European countries if you look at the global index of corruption. I mean, countries like Botswana, etc. But always people pick up on the DRC or the few corrupt places that becomes Africa. So we have this issue of perception, and I think we have a big fight in our hand really to close this gap between reality and perception, because that's what will help investors really to come to invest in Africa.
The African systems and the government needs to promote the African entrepreneur. The African needs its own entrepreneur to lead and develop its own system. Build its own factories and industries are very important. For that reason, you are able to see the job creation within the continent. If Africa does not move forward to support its own entrepreneur, if there is no entrepreneurial mindset within the continent, if African entrepreneurs are not encouraged to invest within the continent, that could be a difficult problem, because in most African countries, governments tend to employ more people, and that's not going to be sustainable. When you look at developed countries, it's more of the private sector. By encouraging those serial entrepreneurs coming in, or those who are ready to invest their money to build factories, build more productive aspect, or create jobs, build products that could be able to create employment within the African continent, that will help the continent in developing itself, and also making sure that it transforms the entirety and giving a different picture as to the way that most people look at the African continent. More importantly, the African entrepreneur needs to be empowered and giving them the tools that is needed for them to grow and also build businesses that will be sustainable and longer than waiting for international companies to come to the continent and create jobs. But if it is an African business, African company, African entrepreneur, they have a different perspective and they can weather the storm no matter how difficult it is, and they will lead the continent to growth. This is something very important that the African continent and countries should be focusing on at the moment.
What I think the difference between Africa and Asia, yes, the Asian tigers, they are able to grow because they are really focused, and they have more entrepreneurs than Africa, because some of us were always waiting for foreign investors to come. A foreign investor will not really go into where he's not very much aware of. So you need those local investors to be able to lead in expanding the growth or the trajectory of African economies. But, let me give you an example. For example, today, when you look at it, a lot of people, they try to discourage even the Africans from investing. You will not believe that the entire sub-Saharan Africa, we only have 2 working refineries. So every single thing that you are talking about in terms of petroleum products is being imported. And because anytime when somebody wants to build a refinery, say, no, don't even try it, because it is a no-go area. You can't even do it. It's not done. It's not possible. So these are the sort of things that we have. So we must change the narrative and say, okay, fine, how do we really do it ourselves? Okay, the economy of Japan or Korea was not established by the Americans. So we have to do it ourselves.
Something more that the African continent should focus on is to change the narrative. Africa has been perceived as a single country from the eyes of many around the world. This needs to change. This needs to build from within. There's more Africans who have to go out there to kind of make sure to educate people in different ways. Governments need to also set out strategy to make sure that this information sinks into the minds of both investors and global leaders, and also other entrepreneurs coming from different parts around the world who want to invest within the continent, and the transactional approaches, and also businesses that are coming in. By Africans themselves changing the narrative will help the continent come out from this narrative of being the dark continent in different ways, or looking at a place where businesses cannot function properly, or there cannot be any success. There's been much success within the African continent in different ways, but again, the Africans themselves need to make sure that they change these narratives by projecting new attitude, projecting more constructive and educational approaches in different things, making sure that the African continent and people take more responsibility. The leaders should become more transformative. The approaches should be something that leads for the betterment of the African people. In that way, it will give the world a different perspective from a different angles to see that the continent has moved forward and the people are taking responsibility and doing their things in their own way. From that way, the respect keep coming in, making sure that the continent transform in different ways as well.
As somebody invested in Africa before, and I still invest in Africa, there is a problem of perception of Africa in the mind of investors. Some of it comes out, of course, of ignorance, because Africa is 54 countries, and these countries also have different characteristics. In the media outside, people usually talk about Africa, just one lump sum of something. So if there is a problem in Somalia, or if there is a problem in the Sahel or somewhere, it's a problem in Africa. And that creates a perception that Africa really is like the Wild West or like a dangerous place, and that doesn't help with investors.
African countries should work towards a closer collaboration. More cooperative way of operating will give the continent more focus and more strength. With looking at the current division within the continent in terms of regional bodies, in the southern African part, you have the ECOWAS, you do have the Central African CEMAC, and you do have different regional bodies in East Africa. This is perceived by investors as a big line where the continent could be divided into small pieces, and in that way it's being played on the advantage of the investors and the disadvantage of the African continent. Looking at regional bodies working along the continent could work with them in one particular aspect. If the continents actually focus in those areas with a collaborative approach with looking at those 54 countries, it gives Africa a more stronger and better background, or a competitive advantage to kind of bargain in a whole lot of other areas. But with just having one particular direction will affect the continent. Most people and investors from around the world perceive Africa to be as a single country, which is not the case. However, by them looking at the African continent in this way, it's very easy by those different regional bodies to split the continent and divide them in different ways. In that area, they are able to focus on a different strategy on different countries and focus on different aspects in different countries. That way, it doesn't give the continent a clear picture as to how they can galvanize themselves to really act as one part to transform the region. In that area, a more collaborative approach and making sure that the goal to drive the continent forward to be at the core of their organizational strategy or the country's level strategy. Without this, there will be a challenge in moving the continent forward. The last but not the least should be the healthcare system. More government approaches and the private sector to invest a little bit more into the healthcare system. By investing into the healthcare system, will strengthen the Africans' performance in different areas. A healthy population will be healthy to production and in different areas. Because there is a big problem with in terms of the African aspect on many government officials and also wealthy people travel to attend medical support abroad. There's nothing wrong for you to secure medical support from abroad or take treatment wherever you want to. However, those who are responsible to managing the healthcare facilities, developing those systems, are responsible for that. If you know you're not able to manage those services and take responsibility in making sure that you can develop the healthcare of your own country and improve the life of your citizen, there is no need for most of those professionals to take those particular positions. Africa should invest in its healthcare system to train its medical expert. There's more brain drain. More medical experts from the African continents are moving to the United Kingdom, to within Europe, and also the United States and Australia and different parts across the world. By them making sure that the aspect of healthcare is strengthened, this will develop the systems and allow those government officials themselves to go to those very hospitals. Because as is commonly said within the African continent, for those who are familiar with such parables, that the way you make your bed, so shall you lie on it. By them making sure that the continent is producing its own medical experts and supporting those healthcare facilities, it will become more strengthened and will reduce the number of medical trips that most leaders across the continent take to go abroad and spend fabulous money, the citizens' cash and the taxpayers' money in those continents. By then strengthening those particular healthcare services, it will enable them to grow in those different areas. Hopefully, we've been able to inform you with regards to the 7 top things that the African continent should do to become even more competitive. Of course, there are different things that the continent is doing now already, which is valuable, it's important. But again, based on our assessment, we think that by implementing and strengthening and building a little bit more on these 7 top things will make Africa not just being perceived in a different way, it will become even more focused and the continent will become more competitive in the future. Thanks very much for watching EDUSPLORER. Hopefully we've informed you. We are looking forward to meeting you in our next episode, and have a good day. Bye-bye.